Welcome to Boxed Out. I'm Amanda Lynn, your host, and I'm here with Lincoln Bormann, the director of the San Juan County Land Bank. Lincoln, thanks for being with us today.
My pleasure. Happy to be here.
Yeah, I'm so excited about this conversation. I think that this is a really critically important topic, and folks in our community don't necessarily always know the ways that conservation and housing interact with each other. So I'm super excited to dive in. We are open to calls in the second half of this episode, which will air next week, so feel free to call in starting at 12:30 if you are interested in asking us questions. So I'm going to kick it off. I would love to have us just provide the audience with an overview of the land bank, what it is,
Sure.
how it works, when it started, that kind of thing.
Absolutely. So the land bank, and we switched over to calling ourselves the conservation land bank because there's so many different kinds of land banks out there. We found it's confusing for people. So what we do is exactly that, conserve land. We're the county's conservation arm. So we're funded by a 1% real estate excise tax paid by the purchaser. And we take that money and we purchase properties either to create preserves, which we own outright, or to purchase conservation easements on private properties. Just basically like you're purchasing mostly development rights from private property owners who might have a farm and they want to continue to farm and they're struggling with the economics of farming. If we can come in and pay them to keep the farm together, basically, and limit how much development happens, it can help them out hugely. So this started in 1990. It was there's a state enabling legislation which allows this to happen. It has to be approved by the voters, and so that's happened 3 times, and we're coming up this year on number 4. So it's important, I think, for people to really understand what the program is, why it's important. So what have we done? I guess we'll come around to those issues. But
yeah, absolutely. I think one thing I happen to know about the original legislation that created the land bank is that it was intrinsically tied in with legislation to create a housing real estate excise tax. And my belief, maybe you can confirm this for me, is that philosophically that was about really building healthy communities and ensuring that where housing development is happening, there's also an opportunity for public land access. Would you say that's the case?
I think that's absolutely right. The people who are going to benefit the most from what we do, and we have 31, almost 32 preserves open to the public, are really the folks who can't afford to buy a big piece of property. They can't afford to buy a mountain or a shoreline property. They're going to be living in an apartment or on a smaller piece of property. We're there to provide resources to those kinds of folks who just can't buy their own mountain.
Yeah.
So I think it's really critical because you tend to get locked into your routine. You go to work, you come home, you go to take your kids to schools, you go to sports practice, whatever it is. But we provide that opportunity for people to step outside of that a little bit, and it's really been, I think, quite critical, particularly when we went through the pandemic. We saw huge numbers of people showing up at our preserves because it was a place they could go and be and really recharge.
Yeah. And in a community like ours, I mean, we're an island. We have a finite amount of land, a finite amount of public access. Is it true that we have some of the least by ratio access to public lands in the state? And that's just because we're a small island, but it means that public land's all the more critical.
Right. Well, particularly in Western Washington. So we've got the lowest percentage of public land of any county in Western Washington. When you look at those other counties, they've got a lot of federal ownership. So it's maybe not a fair comparison, but even something, if you look at the city of Anacortes, 30% of that city has been set aside and is in public land conservation ownership, whereas in San Juan County, it's 16.5%. There's another 0.5% that's public, but that's things like port property or school property. So we're dramatically lower than almost everybody else.
Wow, which kind of gets back to how these things all tie together. Like I mentioned, the San Juan County Land Bank is linked to housing in a variety of ways, the Conservation Land Bank, from kind of generally being part of building a healthy community to actually directly aiding affordable housing efforts and the larger picture of providing affordable housing for our community. Can you talk a little bit about how housing and conservation relate to each other?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the two are really integrally linked. And so first, before we get to that,
Yeah.
I want to talk about the separation of the two, because I think there's some confusion about what we do and how it might negatively impact affordable housing. And in reality, most of the affordable housing that we're going to be doing in the islands is in the urban growth area or in the town where people have access to resources, the septic, sewer systems, electric, all of those kinds of things. When we're purchasing property for the land bank, we make great efforts actually to be very careful about reducing density in those areas and focusing our efforts outside of them. So a lot of the property that we buy is in different land tax classifications, like designated forest land, which is about the lowest you can pay. And basically what that means is that those properties have been set aside for commercial timber operations.
Right.
We're purchasing them for conservation, but it's not in competition with affordable housing efforts in that those properties are far from the services you need, and really they're serving two completely separate purposes. So when we purchase properties, people still have access to them as a resource, but it's really not competing with affordable housing efforts. There's actually quite a lot of vacant parcels in the county, over 7,600 vacant parcels throughout the county. So there are plenty of parcels for people to buy, but are they affordable? Generally, no.
Yeah.
And so the affordable housing groups that we have are really an essential piece of this. And so the fact that we have this, the conservation rate tied to the affordable housing rate, which allows both of us to thrive, is just critical.
Yeah.
Because it's two separate resources that are being provided together.
Yeah, I would totally agree as a housing advocate in the community. I think from a variety of perspectives, not only to just sort of echo what you're saying around what the different purposes of, say, a community land trust, which is another operation that is banking land for
Right.
communal use,
Right.
and a conservation land bank. Typically, the community land trust and other housing organizations in general are really building within the urban growth area, as you mentioned. And that's not only philosophically important to keep housing affordable and, as you said, tie to infrastructure, that's also a climate strategy.
Right.
That's a really critical way that we
Right.
address climate change is by building densely and in areas that are identified as growth areas.
Right.
And capable of managing that growth. And a key piece of that, as someone who has always lived rurally and loves living rurally and loves being out in nature, but also enjoys walking to work every day and, not needing to own a car.
Right.
It's really an awesome thing, and that is based on really careful planning. In Washington, we have the Growth Management Act, which sort of mandates all of that and designates what areas of any community are prime for development versus prime for conservation. And the end result is that we get to have both.
Right.
We get to live in town, we
Right.
get to go out to these public access
Right.
lands. Yeah.
And I would say that there are opportunities to have affordable properties outside of the UGA. And we've worked with Lopez Community Land Trust on some of those, where they've had properties they've been able to buy. And it's when they're purchasing a big property, they don't need it. They may be trying to create a couple of farmsteads on that property. But for example, around Lopez Hill, there was a large property that was for sale. They approached us to work together. So we ended up purchasing the majority of that property for conservation. They purchased the rest of it to create a few farmsteads, which is what's happening. So that was a great synergy, because neither of us, I think, had the resources to really purchase the thing completely on our own. And if there are properties out there which can serve different purposes, we're happy to work with affordable housing groups to do something that can create that synergy.
Yeah, and thinking intersectionally, something that I know and have noticed is especially acute in this last year or two is cost of living increases, cost of food for working families is exceptionally challenging. And we also have not the most sustainable food system in the islands. I think that's a pretty well-known fact. And so I think it's the land bank, the conservation land bank, can be an incredible resource to partner with organizations, as you mentioned, to do ag work and preserve land for agriculture.
Yeah, absolutely.
And some of that's definitely happening. Are there other projects besides that Lopez Hill project that were ag-related that you can talk about?
You know, one of the things that's happening right now, which is really exciting, is a project we're working on with the Grange. And this is in our Beaverton Marsh Preserve. This is on the eastern edge. So the marsh has lobes. This is the lobe of it which runs up Roach Harbor Road. But a big piece of that is good agricultural land. And we've been looking to try and lease a portion of that property for that purpose. And now the Grange has stepped up, and we're working with them on a lease. And it's it's a really innovative project. It's not just leasing to a single farmer, it's leasing to them as an organization where they've got a variety of things they're looking to accomplish. So a big chunk of it will be community agriculture. People will be able to have their own little place to grow food, or they'll have producers who may need less property. They don't need 30 acres.
Sure.
You know, they might be able to have an acre and have a successful agricultural operation, and then they can sell their produce through the farmers market. The Grange has a standing booth at the farmers market, and so anybody who's working on that leased property will have access to that as well. And there are a variety of other things that are happening with that, but it's really, you know, that's just an essential tie-in between people who don't have enough land to have a garden. This gives you the opportunity to do it. I mean, I know when I lived in town, I made use of the current community garden out on San Juan Valley Road. It was a fantastic resource to have, but it's full.
That's my understanding, is there's quite a wait list for it,
Yeah.
and we need more spaces like that. Yeah, I think that's really amazing, and I think it speaks to you know, a really deep belief that I have, which is that land is power, and that shows up in a variety of ways.
Right.
And so I think that having that shared opportunity to grow food on the land on our island is a really amazing thing, and exactly sort of the intention and the powerful tool that a conservation land bank can be for community members. I recently actually learned that the San Juan County Land Bank is one of only 2 conservation land banks in the entire United States. Is that true?
There are actually 3.
Okay.
It's kind of interesting because there are a lot of local conservation programs which don't call themselves land banks, and generally aren't funded the way we're funded. They're funded through millage, so taxes that you pay on your property each year. That's not the way we're funded. We're funded through 1% tax on the purchase of property. That's it. That's a one-time thing. So Nantucket, Martha's Vineyard are the other 2 land banks out there in the country. And so, yeah, we're unique. And I think the reason it was set up like this back in 1990 was the recognition that we were going to have people who are moving here. We're going to have a lot of wealthy people moving here, and that continues for sure. And so the idea was, well, you know, if they're going to come here, they should be paying in and enabling us to set property aside for conservation. And so that's how that's worked. And I think it does work for us. That approach, the sales tax approach doesn't work for all communities, but it works for us here.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it is one of those real microeconomic climate things. It really works for us here when you look at the skew of the real estate market. And I think that's another one of the ways that these things tie together. We're
Right.
watching our real estate market escalate in ways that are incredibly dramatic, especially since the pandemic. The average starter home on San Juan Island is in the range of $750,000 at this point, which is just
Right.
impossible for a working family
Right.
to navigate. And so knowing that that's the market that we're in, knowing that homes are being sold often to the highest bidder for cash, and that's
Right.
just the way it rolls, it's really, really critical as that escalates for us to keep a piece of the pie for the community and to ensure a healthy island.
Absolutely. And if you look at how the REIT breaks down in terms of what types of properties are predominantly funding both the conservation REIT and the affordable housing REIT, in 2022, 70% of the REIT funds came from sales of properties that were in excess of $1 million. So that's the larger properties, the more expensive properties are funding the lion's share of these programs.
Yeah. So I want to get into that a little bit. I think a lot of the conversations that I have in the community and a lot of the places where we see maybe an interest in change or maybe nuance that isn't well known is the way that these taxes are also tied together. You know, something that I've wondered myself is it possible to go back and make the structure of the REIT tax a more progressive tax? Is that something that can be done within our local ordinance, or would we need to return to the state legislature and change that legislation to do something like that?
It would have to go back to the legislature. And so the thing about going to the legislature, it's really attractive to folks to think about how we could make better legislation, how we could improve on existing legislation. Anyone who's been part of that legislative process knows how difficult that is.
Yeah.
And how when you start on something, you often end up with something very different than what you came in with. And so it's always a huge risk to take existing legislation and open it and try and turn it into something else. You don't know what's going to come out the other end.
Yeah.
One of the things we definitely know is that the real estate industry is not fond of excise taxes. When the land bank REIT came up the first time, the local realtors basically asked the state association to just stay out of that. The same thing happened with the affordable housing REIT. And this last time around, there's no issue. And I think it's because we're special, honestly. This is a special place. This is the only place that we've had a conservation REIT pass, and obviously affordable housing REIT pass. And we should be proud of that, honestly, that we're progressive enough that we've managed to do this. It's something that no other county's been able to do. The idea of going back in and trying to make it better, it sounds good, but frankly, the legislative process is not called sausage making for nothing. It's a difficult process, and it's just really hard to improve on things, frankly.
I hear you. Yeah, it's sort of like those layers of challenge and progress and getting things moving. I often think as a housing advocate that there's a lot of unity around some of these changes we would like to see, or even widening out the REIT, right? Like the way that the legislation is currently set up, it is pretty narrow, and it essentially only allows San Juan County to do this.
Right.
Other counties in the state would have a really difficult, if not impossible, time implementing what we have implemented
Right.
through our real estate excise tax.
Yep.
And so, one part of me is like wants to see the whole state be able to do this, but also knows
Right.
how much the real estate industry would fight against
Right.
this wider
Right.
movement of resources, quite frankly, across the state of Washington to the public.
Yeah.
And so that's a little bit, it's scary.
Yeah.
And, it's we got to make the sausage
Right.
sometimes. So
Right.
that's for us advocates to do in the community that care about this. And it is also for us to know that we have to strategically plan how to make that sort of change.
Right.
Another thing that I hear often as a housing advocate is, well, I want to see more of the REIT go towards housing and less go towards conservation. And that's another one of these changes that
Right.
would be necessary at the state level. So I think, in my view, I don't know about you, but in my view, it seems like we've got to do that at the right time. We've got to make sure that we're ready to take that on at the state and understand the impacts that that's going to have. And not that we shouldn't, but just we have to be smart about it because it was not easy to get this thing done in the first place.
Definitely. And I would say one of the really interesting things about the relationship between the conservation REIT and affordable housing is, we've been pretty good at leveraging additional resources. And I know that's probably a bad word to use since people associate that with borrowing. What I mean is finding additional resources to help us with conservation projects. And so between us and our partners, we're generally at a one-to-one level. So every dollar of REIT we're spending, we're able to find an additional dollar to help with those projects. Well, with affordable housing, what we're seeing is that ratio is much higher. The affordable housing folks, like you, have been incredibly successful at getting additional resources, and it's not one-to-one, it's more like three-to-one or four-to-one. And that's incredible. So even though the affordable housing REIT is less than the conservation REIT, what you were able to bring to the table is actually more because of that ability. Because of your hard work, really.
But the leveraging ability, I don't think that people always realize that, how much local investment like that allows us at the state and federal level on all of these issues to be able to bring more funds into our community as a whole. And I think from my perspective, housing advocates, conservation advocates, all of these folks need to be working in tandem really closely because these are major issues. And we are going to continue to see wealthy folks move here, trying to escape climate change, trying to be somewhere that's perceived as safe. And so I think it's even more important for us to think through sort of the 100-year plan is what we always call it in the community land trust.
Absolutely.
Community, it's we have to really think in the long haul and really think about where we're going.
Absolutely.
Well, I think that we are going to take a short commercial break, if that works for you, Jeremy, and we will be back in just a few more minutes to continue this conversation. Welcome back to Boxed Out. I'm here with Lincoln Bormann. I'm your host, Amanda Lynn, and we are talking about the San Juan County Conservation Land Bank and how it relates to affordable housing. Lincoln, we've been kind of talking about some of the either misconceptions or nuance around the ways that the REIT actually works. And I think another big misconception that I often run into in the community is the idea that the REIT is a property tax. Can you tell me if that's true or false and give a little more detail on that?
Yeah, that's absolutely false. It's a one-time payment. People also ask us, though, when we purchase property, what the impact is. When we're purchasing a property, it's no longer private. Taxes are no longer being paid on it. And so what does that mean for the rest of the community? And the reality of that is, our purchases really have very limited consequence. And a lot of it, that goes back to when I was talking earlier about the types of property that we purchase. Almost everything, over 75% of what we purchase is in some preferred tax classification where very little tax is being paid on the property. But every year we go through, we look at what the taxable value of our properties is. And granted, some of them are going to be a lot lower than you think because they've been in those categories. And what we've come up with this time around is it's about $60 million. Sounds like a lot, but the taxable value of real estate in the county is actually $14.1 billion. So what we have is a drop in the bucket. We do the exercise of, well, let's hold, taxes the same. What if we took our property and put it back on the market? What savings could a taxpayer expect?
Right.
And the answer is, if you have a $750,000 property, maybe $15 a year, maybe. And frankly, I think there's more value coming out of having these preserves than is reflected in that number. So it's probably, it could even be negative. But in any case, it's not much of an impact.
Yeah, I know even in this landscape, I will happily pay $15 a year to access land
Right.
bank preserves. So, yeah, I guess one sort of other question on that in acquiring land, it sounds like there's a lot of intention. Can you tell me a little bit briefly how the land bank decides what is publicly accessible, what gets used for conservation, that sort of thing?
Right. So we have a number of variables that we're looking at when we're picking properties for conservation. And our mandate is pretty broad. So it can be anything from something that is ecologically exceptional to an agricultural piece of property. So we're looking at all of that and we're deciding, number one, should we own it outright or should we try and work with the existing owner and do a conservation easement? One of the drawbacks of conservation easements is generally public access is not going to be allowed on that property.
Gotcha.
So you just have to accept that idea. Sometimes we can make that work, but often no. If we're purchasing a property outright, we're going to try and make it available to people. That doesn't mean we're going to make the whole thing available to them because we've got a lot of other important elements on those properties, things like wetland areas, which can be
Sure.
quite sensitive, and they're hosting species which are not terribly thrilled about seeing people show up when they're trying to nest, and raise their young. So when we're creating public access, we're really cognizant of that. And we're trying to create a good experience for people, but we're also trying to protect that resource. And that's really our number one value.
Yeah.
We want to make sure that the
conservation piece.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so some properties we have are not open to the public. Few of them, I mean, it's going to be 32 at the end of this month. We'll have open out of 39 preserves. The other ones, it's just been difficult to get to them, or they're just too sensitive, quite honestly, to allow for public access. But we're really constantly trying to marry those two things as best we can, because we know people want to be out there. We want to provide them the ability to go there. And we also want to protect the natural value of the properties as well.
I think that's a great place to leave it, is just that focus on mission of conservation. And Lincoln's going to stay on with me. We're going to continue the conversation offline. You can tune into that episode next week to see the rest of our discussion around the Conservation Land Bank. I really appreciate you all being here with us, and I am looking forward to talking with you more about housing next week. Thank you.